The motion before us, Edmund Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France, predicted the terror, the military dictatorship, and the imperial wars before any of them happened. His argument that institutions embody centuries of accumulated practical wisdom that no single generation of rationalists can reconstruct from first principles was confirmed by every attempt to build a rational social order from scratch in the following 230 years. Burke keeps winning. At the table tonight, three thinkers who approach this question from fundamentally different angles. The empiricist tests claims against what we can actually know, distinguishing carefully between what Burke predicted and what we have retrofitted into prediction after the fact. The geographer sees institutions not as abstract vessels of wisdom, but as concrete arrangements of power, resources, and constraint, each one built for specific circumstances that may no longer obtain. The essayist watches how human beings actually behave when the script breaks, and asks whether our reverence for inherited forms might itself be the greatest obstacle to seeing what is required now. What is at stake is not merely historical. We are speaking from inside 2026. A civilization navigating climate disruption, technological transformation that is remaking the terms of production and cognition, and political fractures that map uncomfortably well onto Burke's warnings about the consequences of treating society as an engineering problem. The question is whether Burke identified a permanent constraint on human political possibility, or whether each generation's particular catastrophes have different causes that we obscure by treating them all as confirmation of the same thesis. Empiricist, you have the floor.
The first question is what counts as confirmation. We say Burke predicted the terror, but the reflections appeared in November 1790, 16 months after the Bastille fell. By then, the October days had already happened. The king had been dragged back to Paris by a crowd that put two guards' heads on pikes. The church lands were nationalized. The National Assembly had abolished feudalism and redrawn the map of France into geometric departments. Burke was not predicting revolution. He was watching one in progress and projecting its trajectory. That is still impressive if he got the trajectory right. But did he? The text predicts that disorder will produce military dictatorship. It does not predict Napoleon specifically. It predicts that some popular general will emerge from the chaos and draw the eyes of all men upon himself. That happened. But it also happened after Cromwell, after Caesar, after every sustained period of civil disorder since armies became professionalized. The Praetorian pattern is older than the Roman Empire. Calling it prophecy is like predicting that winter follows autumn. What Burke actually got wrong is more interesting. He predicted the revolutionaries would fail to establish any stable government at all, that France would collapse into permanent chaos requiring external intervention to restore order. France did not collapse. By 1794, the Committee of Public Safety had crushed the Vendée, stabilized the currency, and fielded armies that defeated the First Coalition. By 1804, Napoleon had the Code Civil. By 1810, French administration was the most efficient in Europe. The revolution worked, which is why it spread. The empirical test is this: find me a modern state that built durable institutions by preserving inherited ones intact and compare it to states that rebuilt from revolutionary rupture. South Korea junked Confucian hierarchy, wrote a new constitution in 1948, land reformed in 1950, and became industrial in a generation. Taiwan did the same. Japan's Meiji reformers gutted the shogunate and built a modern state in 30 years. Germany's Wirtschaftswunder followed total collapse. The fastest institutional modernizations in history followed the most complete breaks with the past. Burke's thesis predicts they should have failed. They did not fail. That is not a complication. That is disconfirmation. The burden on Burke's defenders is not to show that revolutions sometimes go badly. They do, and obviously. The burden is to show that the mechanism he identified, accumulated wisdom destroyed by rationalist hubris, is causally doing the work. But Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson spent 20 years mapping institutional development across dozens of countries and found that what predicts durable governance is not continuity but inclusivity, whether institutions incorporate broad coalitions or extract for narrow ones. Burke's beloved English Constitution was extractive for Catholics, for the Irish, for the propertyless majority, for 2 more centuries after he praised it. The accumulated wisdom was accumulated by particular people for particular purposes. So I put this directly to the essayist. When Burke defends inherited institutions, which inheritance exactly, and inherited by whom?
The empiricist measures the engine's performance, and I grant him his figures. The Code Civil was indeed a marvel of rational administration. The Meiji oligarchs did, in fact, achieve in a single generation what had taken Britain 2 centuries. But this is to mistake the blueprint for the city. The question is not whether a new order can be imposed, but what happens to the people who must live in the quiet violence of its imposition. Let us move from the 18th century to the end of the 20th. The collapse of the Soviet Union was followed by another great experiment in rational design, this time imported not from Rousseau, but from the University of Chicago. Shock therapy was the name given to the plan to build a market economy from first principles. Old institutions were not to be reformed, they were to be swept away. Consider the city of Magnitogorsk in the Urals, a city willed into existence by Stalin in the 1930s, built around one of Russia's largest steel plants. The entire city was an institution, a cradle-to-grave system of meaning and obligation. Let us imagine a man who lives there. His name is Victor. He is a steelworker, as his father was. His life is not one of liberty, but it is one of profound certainty. He has a job, a flat, healthcare, a pension. The accumulated wisdom of this place, however brutal its origins, is a grammar of social survival. Then, in 1992, the rationalists arrive. They see only inefficiency. The factory is privatized for a fraction of its worth. The social assets, the clinics, the holiday camps, are stripped away. Victor's pension evaporates in hyperinflation. The life he understood is declared irrational. In the early 1990s, male life expectancy in Russia fell by several years, a demographic collapse unseen in an industrialized nation in peacetime. Victor is not a statistic in that collapse. He is the reason it happened. The mistake of the rationalist is to think of society as a forest of individual trees that can be clear-cut and replanted with a more productive species. They forget the soil. They forget the mycelial network of trust, reciprocity, and informal knowledge, the unwritten constitution of a place that connects every tree to every other. You can destroy it in a day. It takes centuries to grow back. The empiricist is correct that the architects of rupture in Meiji Japan and post-war Europe did not fail to build powerful states. But the architects of shock therapy did not fail either. They created oligarchs, they hollowed out the industrial heartlands, and they left a geography of despair that made the arrival of a strong man in the mold of Huey Long, the redeemer figure, the man who promises to restore what the experts took, not just possible but yearned for. This is a pattern older than modernity. Sulla stepping back through the gates of Rome, Bolivar riding into the vacuum left by the liberators who had dismantled every colonial institution without building anything to replace it. Burke's argument is not that revolutions always fail to produce a state, it is that they always succeed in destroying a society. The empiricist has simply failed to notice the difference.
Both the empiricist and the geographer assume that a society must either transmit its institutions across generations or replace them through deliberate redesign. That binary leaves out the third pattern now visible at scale. Millions of people are simply withdrawing their participation from inherited forms without replacing them with any new blueprint. Voter turnout in national elections has fallen steadily in most established democracies since the 1970s. Trade union density has dropped by more than half in the same period across the United States, Britain, and much of Western Europe. Weekly religious attendance across the same countries has collapsed from majority participation to single-digit figures within 2 generations. Not because congregants converted to rival faiths, but because they stopped attending anything at all. These are not declarations of revolutionary intent. They are repeated individual decisions to invest less time, less loyalty, and less habitual observance in the existing arrangements. The closest historical parallel is not 1789 or 1917, but the behavior of urban populations in the later Roman Empire. Between the 3rd and 5th centuries, city councils across the western provinces emptied as prosperous families retreated to rural estates, stopped funding public games and temples, and ceased standing for local office. The forms remained on the statute books. The people who had once sustained them stopped doing so. Central authority did not fall because a new rational order was imposed. It fell because the old order had already been abandoned from within. What the present withdrawal reveals is that institutions do not survive on their accumulated wisdom alone. They survive on continued daily use. When that use declines, the question is no longer whether a generation can redesign society from first principles. The question is whether any principles, inherited or invented, will command enough ordinary conduct to hold a society together at all. You claim that the fastest institutional modernizations in history followed the most complete breaks with the past. In post-independence India after 1947, where the new state explicitly rejected Mughal and British revenue systems in favor of rational planning, why did rural households continue to settle disputes through caste panchayats and informal credit networks at rates that dwarfed use of the new district courts for the following 40 years?
You have caught me generalizing from the exceptional cases. The formal institutions I cited, constitutions, land reform, industrial policy, did indeed take root rapidly in post-war Northeast Asia, but you are right that beneath them, the informal structures persisted far longer than the legal redesign would suggest. That does not refute the possibility of institutional reconstruction. It reveals that successful reconstruction almost always involves keeping more of the informal substrate than the revolutionaries admit. But now, turn the lens on yourself. If withdrawal from inherited forms is the dominant pattern, why does it produce such radically different outcomes? Japan's fertility rate has been below replacement since 1974. Sweden's since 1972. Japan's institutions remain trusted. Public infrastructure still functions, corruption indices remain low, social cohesion holds. Sweden's do too. Yet in the same decades, southern Italy saw the same withdrawal produce. Institutional collapse, tax evasion as civic norm, infrastructure decay, the systema of clientelism filling the void. What makes one withdrawal produce quiet dysfunction and another produce state failure? Or are you claiming the difference does not exist? The Geographer constructed the Romanian miner, called down from the Jiu Valley in 1990 to beat back the students in Bucharest, to illustrate what shock therapy destroyed, the mycelial network of trust, reciprocity, and informal knowledge that takes centuries to grow back. But let me press on the construction itself. You describe life under Ceausescu's command economy as one of profound certainty: job, ration book, housing allocation, workplace clinic. Yet by the late 1980s, Romania's industrial base was consuming electricity it could not generate, and exporting food its population could not afford to lose, all in service of a foreign debt repayment schedule that had already reduced caloric intake below subsistence norms. The certainty you describe was being purchased by raiding the biological capital of the population itself. Infant mortality was rising, recorded in statistics the regime classified as state secrets. Here is my question. When inherited institutions are not vessels of accumulated wisdom, but rather Ponzi schemes whose mathematics have already failed, what distinguishes preserving them from preserving the illusion that postpones necessary adjustment until catastrophic collapse becomes the only remaining option?
You have caught me romanticizing the ruin. The certainty I described for Victor was indeed built upon an actuarially bankrupt foundation. I grant the point entirely. The question then is not whether to abandon a failing system, but how. In 1978, in China's Anhui province, the farming commune of a woman we might call Chen Lihua was also a Ponzi scheme, one that produced periodic famine. But the change that came was not a blueprint dropped from a great height. It was a local, illicit experiment. the household responsibility system where families could sell their own surplus. Beijing did not design this, it noticed it and allowed it to spread. This was institutional succession, not liquidation. The catastrophe in Kampuchea was not the admission that French colonial administration had been extractive and corrupting. It was the Khmer Rouge's conviction that year zero was an engineering solution, that you could drain a city of 2 million people in a single afternoon and pour a new civilization into the empty vessel. What is the wisdom in destroying the lifeboats along with the sinking ship? The essayist, you describe a quiet secession from the formal state. Let us go to a place where that happened. In the peripheral barrios of Caracas today, the Venezuelan state has effectively withdrawn. Rubbish is not collected, the water is not reliable, the police do not come. Yet order exists. It is the order of the colectivos, armed gangs who run the rationing, dispense justice, and control who enters and who leaves. My question is this: is the withdrawal you describe ever truly a retreat into a private sphere? Or is it simply an invitation for a different and often more primitive form of power to fill the void?
Your Medellin example forces a sharper distinction between passive disengagement and outright institutional rupture. In Colombia, the state had already extracted and dismantled local capacities before retreating, leaving paramilitary structures as the only scalable coordination left. Where withdrawal occurs from institutions that still retain some residual trust, the pattern tends instead towards small-scale mutual aid and private ordering, neighborhood watches, informal lending circles, or online skill sharing that do not require coercion. The difference turns on whether daily habits of cooperation survive the exit. When they do, the resulting order is thinner than the old state, but rarely reverts to the level of the AUC-era bloc commanders who taxed every market stall and arbitrated every local dispute at gunpoint.
The question beneath the question is this: can a society tell the difference between an institution that has failed and one that is being abandoned? We are in 2026. The European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism takes effect next year, a rationalist redesign of trade rules to save the climate. Marine Le Pen polls at 38%. In Britain, the NHS had 7.6 million people on waiting lists last winter. Usage continues. Faith does not. In the United States, 4 million fewer students enrolled in university in 2023 than in 2010, the largest sustained decline in a century. Not because the credential lost its value, but because the debt required to obtain it now exceeds what the median graduate will earn in the first decade of use. Are we inside a Burkean moment? A generation of rationalists rebuilding from first principles what they do not understand? Or are we inside the thing the essayist named? A civilization slowly withdrawing its daily effort from arrangements that no longer return what they cost? And if the second, can you see it from inside, or does it only become visible in the transcript that gets written 50 years later?
The host asks if we can see the dissolution from inside. The answer depends entirely on where one is standing. The map of a system and the experience of that system are two different geographies. Let us go to Youngstown, Ohio. Once the steel capital of the world, its collapse beginning in the late 1970s was described by economists as structural adjustment and sectoral reallocation. That is the view from the center. It is a view composed of index numbers. A few streets from where the Mahoning Valley's last integrated mill stood, a man named Dennis had run a small machine shop supplying specialized components to the steelworks for 30 years. When the mills shuttered, the economist models registered a subtraction. So many primary jobs lost. What the models did not register was Dennis's shop and the tool and die man 2 doors down, and the diner that fed the second shift, and the credit union that held their mortgages. For Dennis, the question was not whether the industry had declined or undergone creative destruction. Those are analysts' terms. His reality was the second notice from the bank arriving in the same week his oldest employee of 18 years came in and simply wept. What he experienced was a trophic cascade. The decline of the central organism is not a simple subtraction. It is an unraveling of the entire ecosystem in ways the spreadsheets cannot anticipate. From his vantage point, the rational language of management is a profound violence because it renders his reality, the slow administrative cancellation of his life, invisible. You can only perceive the system's failure from the place where it is failing. From the center, where the budgets are being balanced and the mission statements rewritten, it looks like prudent navigation. It may even look like success.
The geographer's Detroit street grid analogy illuminates structural rigidity from the inside. Aggregate behavior shows something different. People who can exit are doing so at scale, not merely retreating but reallocating their daily effort toward arrangements that require less fixed loyalty. Census Bureau figures record roughly 800,000 net domestic moves out of the Northeast and Midwest combined in 2022 alone, concentrated among working-age households with children. These are not random flights. They track states with lower property taxes, lighter land use rules, and weaker public service mandates. The deeper pattern is that withdrawal has become self-reinforcing through selection. Those who stay in legacy institutions are increasingly the ones least able to exit: older homeowners, public employees, or the poor tethered to remaining transfers. The resulting mismatch produces zombie maintenance rather than renewal, budgets balanced by raising fees on the immobile while the mobile build parallel systems elsewhere. Private schooling, direct primary care, and neighborhood security subscriptions have all risen sharply in the same high migration corridors since 2015. These are not blueprints imposed from above. They are repeated private decisions that treat inherited forms as optional infrastructure rather than inherited obligation. The single case of a Rust Belt assembly worker whose seniority rights kept him rooted through 3 rounds of plant consolidation cannot capture this sorting effect. It registers only the damage to those left behind. The behavioral record registers the accumulating preference for thinner, exit-friendly substitutes. Once that preference passes a threshold, the original institutions do not merely decline. They lose the marginal participants whose continued use had kept them minimally viable. At that point, the question is no longer whether rational redesign can succeed. It is whether any remaining users will still perform the daily acts that make an institution legible as a shared fact rather than a billing address.
The essayist claims withdrawal becomes self-reinforcing through selection. The geographer shows us what happens to those who cannot exit. But we need to distinguish carefully between 2 different processes that produce superficially similar outcomes. Materials science offers the relevant framework, hysteresis. A ferromagnetic material magnetized in one direction does not simply return to its original state when the external field is removed. It retains residual magnetization. The path back is not the reverse of the path forward. Some changes are reversible. Others embed themselves in the structure and persist even after the forcing stops. What the geographer described in his fourplex is not a reversible withdrawal. It is structural hysteresis. Once the graduate students leave and the coffee shop closes, the rental market for that block has fundamentally changed. Even if enrollment recovered tomorrow, those units would not simply refill. The ecosystem has crossed a threshold. New equilibria are path-dependent. But the essayist's claim about selection requires a different test. If exit is concentrating the immobile in legacy systems, we should see institutional quality declining faster than funding alone predicts. We do not consistently see this. NHS waiting times rose substantially over the 2010s, even as broader indicators of clinical quality did not uniformly deteriorate. Quality did not simply track resources. Public school performance in Detroit showed mixed results between 2010 and 2020, according to state and national assessment data, despite significant losses in teaching staff. These are not zombie institutions staffed by the trapped. They are institutions where remaining participants compensated for exodus through higher per capita effort. The pattern breaks the other direction in Greece after 2010. Medical brain drain removed 18,000 doctors between 2010 and 2017, roughly a quarter of the workforce. Hospital mortality rates for treatable conditions rose 40% in the same window, according to Lancet figures. There, the selection effect operated exactly as the essayist predicted. Exit concentrated incompetence. What distinguishes these cases? One hypothesis. Hysteresis depends on whether tacit occupational knowledge survives the formal withdrawal. Consider what industrial sociologists call communities of practice. the dense lateral apprenticeships through which experienced Detroit teachers transmitted pedagogical judgment to newer colleagues operating entirely outside contractual obligation or union structure. Greek hospitals lost their senior cohort too rapidly and too completely for that transmission to occur. The institutional vessel emptied before the next generation could absorb what it held. The knowledge walked out with the people and left no residue. But that is precisely what we cannot see from aggregate behavior. The essayist is right that people are reallocating effort. Whether that reallocation produces resilience or collapse is empirically unresolved.
People continue to perform the single administrative act that keeps an inherited rule enforceable only when that act still yields a private return they cannot obtain elsewhere. In the United States, the number of households that obtained a formal mortgage modification through the Federal Home Affordable Modification Program between 2009 and 2016 reached roughly 1.8 million, even while the same population sharply reduced its use of conventional bank branches and local credit unions for everyday transactions. The modification preserved one narrow channel of state-backed credit. The rest of the banking relationship was quietly rerouted to apps and non-bank lenders. That selective dependence is now the operative pattern. Institutions survive where enough individuals still need one concrete output from them and die where that output can be sourced elsewhere. The rest is theater performed for observers who are no longer in the room.
The empiricist spoke of hysteresis, the essayist of selective dependence. Let us see what they look like on the ground. In the Po Valley of northern Italy, a fourth-generation rice farmer named Cristina manages 280 hectares under a water-sharing arrangement that dates, in its essentials, to the Canal Consorzio, established under Habsburg administration in the 18th century. The rotational allotment system she inherits was never rationally designed. It accreted, dispute by dispute, drought by drought, into a lattice of obligations that no single engineer could have specified in advance. Now the alpine snowpack that feeds it is retreating by measurable meters each decade. Regional hydrologists have produced an elegant reallocation model. Cristina has not rejected it, she has simply not waited for it. Over the past 3 years, she has converted a third of her paddies to a drought-tolerant Japonica hybrid developed at the University of Pavia, installed soil moisture telemetry that cuts her draw by 30%, and negotiated a private water banking arrangement with 2 neighboring communes. She has not dismantled the consortio. She has grown quietly independent of its most fragile assumptions while it continues to function for those who need it. The lesson is not that inherited institutions are inviolable or that planned reforms are futile. It is that the most consequential adaptations are rarely announced. They are registered years later in the quiet arithmetic of who remained solvent and who did not, long after the redesigners had moved on to the next blueprint.
I entered this debate believing that the empirical test was whether revolutionary ruptures produced durable institutions. I no longer believe the test is institutional durability at all. The moment my thinking shifted was the geographer's question about Victor's pension being actuarially bankrupt. I conceded the point, but then realized I had conceded something deeper. An institution can be formally intact, statistically measurable, and already dead in the only sense that matters. It no longer commands the belief of the people whose daily cooperation keeps it animate. What changed is this. I had been measuring state capacity, budgets, coverage rates, administrative reach. The essayist forced me to see that none of those metrics capture the prior question. Are people still performing the unremarkable acts that make a rule enforceable rather than merely announced? The question this debate should have asked, but did not. Is there a replication crisis in institutions themselves? In psychology, findings replicate when independent researchers can reproduce them. An institution replicates when a new generation, inheriting its forms, can reproduce the behaviors that made it functional. Fertility below replacement for 50 consecutive years means no new cohort is arriving to staff the inherited arrangements. That is not withdrawal. That is replication failure at the species level. Burke's insight was that you cannot reconstruct from blueprints what you do not understand. The empiricist's reply was, but we have done so repeatedly. Both claims now look incomplete. The deeper problem may be that we can neither preserve what we have nor rebuild what we abandon, because we have stopped producing the humans who would do either.